Um, okay, so unfortunately, Sarah Richardson couldn't be with us today, so I'm going to give her talk instead. Hopefully, I don't butcher it. Okay, bit of background. So nectar-rich flowers and fleshy fruits are a major source for possums, rats, and birds in warm mixed species forests. But one of the things we're kind of interested here is like, how can we model when these resources are available? And this is particularly relevant in terms of elevation gradients. So one of the ideas is that protracted long fruiting periods mean that resources are available for longer, and therefore organisms like rats are able to breed for longer. And so we want to use this information that we're getting from here to kind of feed into the rest of our models and kind of moderate how we represent resources in space. So the focus today is on sort of duration and synchrony amongst individuals. So we're not the first to have considered this, and Peter Wardle provided us with some clear predictions. And he said that in the lowlands, most aspects of seasonal behaviour are less well defined and more protracted than in regions with strong seasonal climates. Whereas at high altitudes, short growing seasons impose a more rigid phenological cycle on most species. Now, he didn't sort of say much about synchrony, which is the other thing we're interested in, but there's recently a really nice paper come out with a 20-year data. It's quite extraordinary. Like it's well worth looking at. But anyway, what they found was that flowering synchrony increased with elevation, and what they felt was that there was a driver of mixture of climatic constraints and competition for pollinators and dispersers at low elevations, which was kind of behind this pattern. So in terms of representing our hypotheses, so each of these lines that you can see on these figures represents the flowering or fruiting period of an individual species. So on the right there, we have a protracted and unsynchronized forest. So you've got very long period of flowering and fruiting, and very few of those species are actually doing things at the same time. On the right-hand side, we've got protracted and synchronized. So what that means is that those curves are kind of very long. So the flowering and fruiting is happening over a very long period of time, but everyone's doing the same thing at the same time. We contrast that with the rigid situation, rigid and unsynchronized, where you've got all these kind of distinct peaks over a long period of time, versus rigid and synchronized, where you've got a very narrow window in which fruiting and flowers are available. And so that top left-hand corner is predicted in warm, low elevation sites. So that's protracted and unsynchronized, so that there is resources available for a long period of time. Whereas at high elevation sites, what we're predicting is it's rigid and synchronized, so that this period in which flowers and fruits are available to birds and rats is much more contracted. Oops. Okay, so what we would expect then across the entire community is that the duration of availability declines with increasing elevation, and that the synchrony increases with increasing elevation. So that forms the basis of the hypotheses for our study. So what we've done is we've looked at flowering fruiting along an elevation gradient at Mount Pirongia. So there's no beach, it's a really high diversity system. And we've got 5 stations, one at 150 meters, 325 meters, 500 meters, 675, and 850 meters. 29 species with all, in all. And we included species in here which had greater than 5% cover. 315 plants monitored, at least 3 per species per elevation. And I'll just note here that there is turnover along this elevation gradient, so there are different suites of species lower down to what there are right at the top. But we try to at least have a few species which are available along most of that gradient. And every 3 weeks for an entire year, someone went out there, mostly James Arbuckle, and looked at flowering and fruiting status of each of those plants. So there's 4 phases that were recognized. So were there buds, were there flowers, were there unripe fruit, and ripe fruit. And so our analysis today focuses on flowering by nectar producing species and fruiting by fleshy fruited species. So this is just a sample of the sorts of data. Now, as you can see, each of those lines represents an individual species, an individual tree. And it's quite messy data, but even just from this raw data, you can see that with flowering at high elevations, we're starting to get a lot more kind of synchrony and kind of compression of that flowering period. But when it comes to fruiting, the raw data looks much less so. It looks like that fruit is available for a much longer period at higher elevation. And so it's very similar across all of those gradients. And so we can construct some metrics that kind of summarize those patterns that you see in the raw data across the whole community. So if we look at flowering by nectar producing species, so it looks like there's 2 clear groups here. There's so few data points that you wouldn't really want to fit a regression, but you can see that at lower elevation, that duration is a lot longer than at high elevation. If that's for flowering, and that's kind of what we could see in the raw data. In contrast, when you look at fruiting by fleshy fruited species, there is much less of a pattern there. There's a possibility at the very lowest sites duration might be slightly longer, but it's not really a very strong pattern, and certainly over the rest of it, you wouldn't be able to draw much conclusion about that at all. Looking at synchrony, so the overlap among individuals, and what we see here is that there's a lot higher synchrony at high elevation than what there is at low elevation, both across flowering and fruiting. And so that sort of confirms our hypotheses. So conclusion and next steps. So duration is greatest at low elevations and synchrony is greatest at high elevations. But these are obviously not simple linear relationships. And so one of the next steps here is to kind of disentangle what the drivers of this change along the gradient might be. So is it because you're getting a change in species richness? And meaning that, if you've got more species, say, at a lower elevation, then you've got a much more protracted flowering and fruiting period. Or is it about the species turnover versus some of this intraspecific variation, so variation within species? And the idea there is that as a species grows up the elevation gradient, its flowering period becomes much more narrow. And so disentangling those drivers will be the next key step with this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. I've got no questions from the floor yet, so please ask them. We've got 5 minutes really. My question then is, okay, it's looking from these preliminary data, if I understand them right, that we've got just as much fruit for just as long, or at least we've got a fruit for just as long at high elevations as we do at low elevations, which is pretty surprising really. Do you think this points to maybe we're looking at perhaps the wrong signal, and we should be looking at some other group for what is sustaining ship rats at low elevation?
Well, I mean, this is obviously only one part of the story, isn't it? I mean, it's we're looking at the duration that they're available, but not necessarily the abundance. So that obviously that productivity in the system will be part of it, I think. I think there's still more to go with this and kind of teasing out a bit more kind of exactly what's underlying some of these results.
I've got a question here. Adrian, do you think plants are less likely to be pollinated and dispersed at high elevation then, given that all resources are much more synchronized?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that. It's a shame. It's a shame we can't have a bit more elaboration on the question.
Well, I'll let that answer ask her to elaborate.
Mm.
I've got a second question here now. Does windfall of flowers differ across the elevation gradient, and could this explain the duration of flower retention?
Yeah, I don't know. We didn't actually put out litter traps and stuff to look at that, and I'm not aware of what other studies have shown in that regard. So I can't really answer that question. Sorry.
Thank you. And from Dave K, are any of the tree species greatly variable between years? Might give an idea if a different pattern would be found if you did it again in a different year. I'm sure James Albuck will be delighted to hear that, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, we'd love to do it over another year, Dave, but as you know, it's actually quite resource intensive and difficult to kind of do this stuff. I think one of the things that the idea of looking at a community was to kind of average as much as possible over those effects. But obviously, you know, if there are quite strong intra-annual variation, that will have an impact on what we're seeing playing out here.
Thanks, Adrian. And from Neil F, how are you accounting for altitudinal changes in mammalian consumers of flowers and fruit?
We're not. The
Yeah,
measures here are fairly qualitative. And so I wouldn't expect that to come out strongly in the data that we've got here. You know, like the slop in our classes for kind of recording this stuff is probably bigger than some of the changes that we might see in some of these consumers. I mean, the idea is to get a handle on the kind of timing, and so the kind of relativity of all of that should hold up, I would think.
I've got a clarification of that earlier question, but I'm going to ask another one first. Is there a relationship between abundance and duration for some species?
There may be, but I think that because we're recording the same number of individuals at each of these things, then we probably won't be seeing that, or at least we won't be detecting that with our data. But you would expect if something was more abundant, then those kind of stragglers that might be less synchronized with the rest of them might prolong the season.
Thanks, Adrian. And just a clarification, or at least an extension of that other question, pollination dispersal. If plant species are synchronized, then competition for dispersers and pollinators should be really high at that period of high availability, whereas at low elevation, if there's less overlap, they all get their day in the sun with the mutualists.
Yeah, and I suppose that was what was kind of underlying that recently published paper and the conclusions that they came to up their elevation gradient, and that there was much higher synchrony higher up, and that was kind of partly driven by some of those interactions that were happening lower down.
Great, thank you very much.